In our last two sessions, we focused in particular upon the anatomy of what took place in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, in the sin of Adam and Chava, in as much as, on the one hand, that sin is what serves as the critical antecedent of, indeed, cause of human nature as we know it today in our post-tree world. Of course, it was in that vein that we responded to the inquiry with respect to the idea of original sin, that while we categorically reject the notion that humanity is in any sense damned as a result of someone else's sin, even if the someone else are our ancestors, we certainly, without doubt, agree that human nature has fundamentally been altered as a result of what took place, which doesn't damn us. It gives us a different mission, as we discussed, of course, at length in particular last time. And in as much as that's the case, in as much as we are then in this post-tree world, and in as much as the critical difference is man is endowed with creativity in the post-tree world, and by consequence of that, there is the element of punishment that is enunciated in the aftermath of the sin, which amounts to the direct consequences of being creative. Creativity hurts, as we noted already last time. We furthermore identify, we noted this briefly last time, we'll need to consider it far more deeply now, what the implications of that creativity are with respect to the transformation that takes place, not merely generally in human nature, but specifically in human free will in our post-tree world. Because, as we noted, there was choice, manifestly, inexorably, in Gan Eden as well. Were that not the case, there could not have been a divine command to which Adam and Chava are held accountable, on the premise, of course, that they, as sentient beings, are able to hear the divine command and to choose whether to obey it or not. Just as we noted, the nature of that choice was on a subtle level of cognition. The inevitable corollary of sentience being an awareness of selfhood and the wherewithal to cast one's perception of reality in terms of that selfhood, as opposed to reality in terms of itself. And that in itself was the undoing of Adam and Chava. Again, as we discussed, in considering what the nature of the sin was, I don't want to excessively rehash where we've already been because we have so much that still lies ahead. But most critically, the consequence of the transformation, which, as we noted, Rashi, in the final verse of Bereshit, Genesis chapter 2, describes the transformation as the internalization of the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, drive toward evil. Drive, inclination, capacity, Yetzer, litzor, to form, to be creative. And Rambam identifies that self-same transformation in terms of the veering toward and ultimately acquisition of imagination, which, as we noted, Rambam himself explicitly identifies with the Yetzer Hara when he tells you that the imagination is the Yetzer Hara in the second unit of the guide in chapter 12. And likewise, we will note two additional crucial comments from the same classic period of the Rishonim, the classic medieval commentators, two additional formulations, which I'm going to aver are other ways of saying the same thing. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra describes the transformation that takes place as the acquisition of ta'ava, lusting. And Ramban, in his Torah commentary, as we noted at the end last time, casts it in terms of ratzon, will. Now, these last two, I think, are transparently two ways of saying the same thing. And indeed, we'll note that Ramban explicitly describes the transformation that takes place in man through this internalization of ratzon, of will, as something that on the one hand is a divine attribute, states, V'zo midah elokit mitzad echad. On the one hand, this is indeed a divine attribute. V'ra'a le'adam b'ichyot lo ba yetzer v'ta'ava. And on the other hand, it is bad for man in as much as it is in him yetzer, drive, creative urge, v'ta'ava, ta'ava, lusting. And I inevitably remind us of the observation that we made that on some plane, it's all about what we might describe, I say this guardedly, in Freudian terms, as libidinal sublimation. In other words, that in as much as ta'ava has been internalized, as Ramban explicitly expresses it, that the attraction between male and female is not merely an expression of nature, but rather something that is accompanied by ta'ava, by lustfulness. That's raw creativity in the most basic, literal, biological sense of the term, physical creativity. And not at all incidentally, it was in the same vein that we noted the Midrash identifies age 10 as the age at which an individual cultivates the Yetzer Hara, appreciating that age 10 roughly corresponds to the initial onset of puberty. And all other forms of creativity are on some plane expressions, reflections of that. Again, libidinal sublimation. Even though Freud himself doesn't seem to have had any acquaintance whatsoever with Torah sources, it's not unlikely that he would have had interactions with Jews who did. And considering in this vein the nature of the transformation, so we have like 4 different formulations, and they all really, in my humble opinion, amount to the same thing. We could call it the internalization of the Yetzer Hara. We could call the Yetzer Hara imagination. We can call it lusting. We can call it will. The critical dimension here is that it is not merely a reflection of some pre-existent nature that pertains to the gamut of the animal kingdom. It is rather something that exists by force of human will. And indeed, the internalization process is precipitated by Adam and Chava choosing to disobey the divine command, not at all incidental. And once again, we reiterate, the consequence of that choice is transformative and ruinous. That in lieu of the manner in which man functions by dint of the divine creation, as Rambam expressed it, cognizant of reality, the ability to distinguish truth from falsity. And this becomes supplanted by dat tov vara, knowing good and evil, where good and evil are not the categorical absolute concepts that are truth and falsity. And moreover, perhaps the most glaring illustration of the difference, as we've noted, is besides the demotion of truth into mere good, that there's been a kind of promotion of falsity, which is non-existence. Something that is false is not. To ra, evil, which is reality. Evil is real. And how does it become real? We make it real. We create that reality. The endowment of, call it what you please, yetzer hara, dimyon, ta'ava, ratzon, the drive toward evil, evil inclination, imagination, lusting, will, whichever terminology you use, that makes us into creative beings endowed with the wherewithal to create a reality where none existed. To create a view of reality, to create, if you will, a universe that we inhabit that enables us to justify the most heinous crimes. How do we justify them? We create a universe in which they're acceptable. That is Ra. And I feel compelled to stress here before moving on an idea that I believe we've noted in other contexts, but it certainly is exquisitely germane here. And this is an observation made by Rambam in Moreh Nebuchim, God of the Perplexed, way downwind of what we've been discussing in the second chapter. I'm referring to the third unit of the Moreh in chapter 8, where Rambam reflects on the implications of a critically important verse that we read in Yeshayahu and Isaiah, where God describes himself as Yotzer Or Uvoreh Choshech, Oseh Shalom Uvoreh Ra. He forms light and creates darkness. He makes peace and creates evil. Of course, in our morning prayers, we don't quote that verse directly. We embellish it, lishna ma'alyata, to make it more seemly. We don't say borei ra, we say borei takol. But the verse concludes that list of 4 attributes with creating evil. And in understanding what the implications of that statement are, of course, the most essential observation that Rambam brings to bear is, even before we get to creating evil, create darkness. There are 3 verbs that are employed in that set of 4 attributes. Forms like creates darkness. How do you create darkness? Darkness isn't the presence, it's an absence. How do you create something that doesn't exist? And Rambam proposes an extraordinary linguistic caveat. He notes, of course, this in itself is the subject of a dissension among the early rabbinic commentators, but he takes the position that I believe is the majority view, that the root boreh, bara, which we're translating as create, pertains specifically to creation ex nihilo, creating something from nothing. It is, after all, in that vein that we consider the instances in which that root appears in the story of creation. Now, I need to note, just for the sake of completeness, that Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra dissents with this interpretation of the verb, because he notes, after all, that besides the opening verse of Bereshit, where we encounter this verb, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, that in the beginning God created ex nihilo, the heavens and the earth. We have two additional verses in which this verb appears, and some plain the implication in the Ibn Ezra is that if we're speaking exclusively of creation ex nihilo, then it should only be in that opening verse. So why is it then that we encounter the same verb again in verse 21, Vayivra Elokim et hataninim hagedolim ve'et kol nefesh hachaya romeset asher sharutzu hamayim leminehem ve'et kol of kanaf leminehu, that God created, also using Vayivra, the great sea creatures, every living creature that creeps, wherewith the waters swarmed after its kind, every winged fowl after its kind. And not only do we find the verb there, but we find it 3 times employed in the context of the creation of man. In verse 27, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo b'tzelem Elokim bara oto zachar u'nekeva bara otam. God created man with his essence, the essence of God. He created him, male and female, he created them. So 3 times in that verse we encounter this verb again. But with all considerable respect for the challenge posed by Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, we'll say, on the contrary, these 2 additional verses, verse 21 and verse 27, prove the thesis that bara means creation ex nihilo. Because what creation ex nihilo essentially means is a discontinuity. Creation of something where there is no antecedent for it before. What's special about verse 21, speaking of the creation of the sea creatures and so on and so forth? Very simply, this is the first verse that describes the creation of animal life. And animal life we don't merely regard as a continuity with that which preceded it. There is a crucial threshold crossed by the creation of the first animals, and that's what we read in verse 21. And that's ex nihilo. That's from nothing. That is, the divine act of creation is manifest in the creation of animal life. And of course, by the same token, we can well appreciate that in verse 27, when we read of the creation of man, that too is, in the most literal sense, ex nihilo, from nothing. The spirit that characterizes man, which is the essential creation that distinguishes man from the animal, has no antecedent in the process of creation. It is indeed from nothing. In any case, that's merely a parenthetical linguistic point. What's germane for our purposes is the realization that inasmuch as the verb bara has this particular association with nothing, creating from nothing, proposes Rambam. So in the first chapter of Tanakh, it refers to creating from nothing. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, it refers to creating a nothing. Creating darkness. Darkness is not a something, darkness is a nothing. And likewise, creates evil. All evil, says Rambam, is deficiency. It isn't a something, it's a nothing. So while That's the linguistic observation. What does it mean in context? What Rambam states it means in context is God creates a world which is a something that contains within it the potentiality of that something being withdrawn, being annulled, creating the potentiality for that withdrawal of something, that annulment, that negation is described as creating a nothing, an absence. God forms light. In forming light, he is creating a world that has the wherewithal for that light to be withdrawn. And that's creating darkness. He makes peace. Of course, peace is a poor translation. Oh, says shalom. He makes completeness, which of course is shalem, the root of shalom. There's completeness, but there's the wherewithal to annul and negate that completeness, to engender deficiency. And that is uvorera, creating evil, the potentiality for that completeness being withdrawn, being annulled. And to put this in completely concrete terms, because I suspect that what we said until now has been awfully abstracted, where's the first place? In all of Tanakh, where the word evil appears. Vorera. Where does it first appear? Of course, the answer at this point should, of course, be self-evident. When God creates the tree that is the tree of knowing good and evil. Eitz hadat tovara. But here's the rub. God creates the tree. He doesn't create evil. He creates the potentiality. The potentiality for man to choose to eat of the tree and thereby make evil not merely a potentiality, but an actuality. So God is Boreira only in the sense that creating an absence means creating a potentiality for that absence. Man actualizes that potentiality by making evil real. That is the sin. That is the direct consequence of eating of Eitz Hadat Tov Bara. And of course, again, the transformation that takes place in man attendant to that, by whatever means one describes it, man is now no longer going to be capable of remaining in Gan Eden. He needs to leave that purely perceptive realm to which he no longer belongs and come into this world, this creative world, and get to work. God sent him on a mission. There's no break in the connection, as we discussed last time. Man now has a charge in this world of creativity to dedicate himself to the fulfillment of the mission with which God has invested him, placing him in this world, ultimately, thereby to fix it up, to become, as it were, God's junior partners through that creative enterprise, which again, we reiterate, is, while fraught with danger, and while indeed it is described in terms of the internalization of the Yetzer Hara, simultaneously, the basis of Hen Ha'adam Haya Ke'achad Mimenu, the divine pronouncement that by virtue of man having eaten of the tree of knowing good and evil, behold, man has become, as it were, as one of us, no longer subsumed within merely the natural realm, but has become a creative being with all of the aspects that inevitably attend to that transformation. And of course, again, by dint of that, we noted last time, the way the Midrash expresses it, that the Holy and Blessed be He who is called Tzaddik v'Yashar, just and upright, creates man in his essence solely in order to be just and upright like him. And that's not commenting on the manner in which God creates man in the anti-tree world. That's describing the assessment of man in the post-tree world. Because it is specifically through the acquisition of the Yetzer Hara, as the Midrash formulates it there. And again, you can use any of the other formulations as well, because I'm convinced the old map the same thing. Specifically through that, you have the summons to be tzaddik v'yashar, just and upright, like God. But of course, inevitably, this brings us to the next major dimension of our discussion here, which is, but how are you going to do it? Because now you are encumbered with this drive, this force, this creativity, however you choose to express it. It's no longer avoidance of falsity, which relatively speaking sounds fairly straightforward, because that which is false doesn't exist. Now it's a choice between good and evil, and they're both realities. Having become endowed with that faculty, you now have the wherewithal to create an alternative reality. Obviously, this is incomparably more fraught than merely where you were, where humanity was when we were still in Gan Eden, before eating of the tree of knowing good and evil. So what do we do now? And on the one hand, of course, it's critical for us to appreciate that what we're doing is something very different from Adam and Chava in Gan Eden. And yet at the same time, it's important for us to appreciate just how much it is essentially similar. I feel compelled at this juncture to share with you a perspective that was enunciated by Eliyahu Dessler. It is presented in Michtav Me'Eliyahu, the collected writings of Rav Dessler, in the first volume of Michtav Me'Eliyahu, which was the first that was produced by his students. This is the first Contras HaBechira, the pamphlet, if you will, that Rav Dessler had evidently produced during the war for his students on the subject of free will. And I appreciate the extent to which the content of this contrast that Rav Dessler produced was something that evidently really animated him, because besides having studied it in Rav Dessler's writings, it was also described to me by two of my mentors who were students of his, here in Panovich, in Eretz Israel, after Rav Dessler came on Aliyah. And the thrust of it, as Rav Dessler so strikingly expresses it at the beginning of his presentation, may be best summarized in an anecdote. And I understand that this anecdote is actually autobiographical. Rav Dessler describes a smoker who, going to bed at night, feels pains in his chest and realizes that the smoking is killing him. And he resolves then and there that he's never going to smoke another cigarette because he doesn't want these chest pains. He realizes it's killing him. And he wakes up in the morning full of this new resolve that he's never going to smoke again, until he feels the urge. And as the urge increases, he says to himself, like, one cigarette isn't going to make a big difference, so I'll smoke the one cigarette. So he smokes one cigarette, which is fine until he feels the urge again. And again, well, it's just one other cigarette, so one other cigarette. And of course, you can see where this is heading. He spends the day smoking not one fewer cigarette than the number of cigarettes he smoked the previous day. And he goes to bed and again feels pains in his chest. And again, resolves he's never going to smoke again. And you can see we are on what certainly has the potential to be an endless loop. And I'm sure each one of us, in some domain of life, can commiserate with this phenomenon, with the resolve and the erosion of that resolve. But let's analyze exactly what's taking place here. Why does he smoke? We might be inclined to say that he smokes because at the end of the day, he's decided that it's killing him, but he enjoys the pleasure of smoking more than he's concerned about the deleterious effects that it has on his health. So he's continuing to smoke, which could conceivably be a decision that one might make, but given the manner in which the anecdote is presented, is clearly not the case. Why do I say clearly not the case? Here's the rub. Because if that were the case, then there would be no games here. Oh, one cigarette isn't going to make a difference. One cigarette is going to make all the difference in the world. The moment that you say one cigarette isn't going to make a difference, you know, deep down, that you're just kidding yourself. And you're going to end up in the same endless loop that you've been in until now, smoking exactly the same number of cigarettes that you were smoking on the previous days. It's not that you said, I don't care about the fact that it's killing me, let's just go ahead and have a good time. You didn't say that. In other words, cognitively, you wanted to live, you didn't want the chest pains, and you wanted to quit. But again, what is the Yetzer Hara / imagination / lust / will? Call it whatever you please. It's the ability to create an alternative reality. You imagine a world in which one cigarette won't make a difference, and you create that world. And here's the critical additional dimension that needs to be stressed. And you lie to yourself. And you know you're lying. Now, I'm going to inevitably re-invoke what we already discussed. The observation of Rav Chaim Volozhiner in Nefesh HaChaim, that the transformation that took place as a result of the sin of Adam and Chava is that prior to the sin, the seduction was coming from outside. You want this. And once the internalization takes place, it's I want this. In both cases, there's a seduction. But on some plane, when the seduction is coming from outside, you do have the wherewithal to be able to say, this isn't me. I and the seduction are two separate and distinct entities. But when the seduction is coming in first person, then there's that powerful urge to say, I am the seduction. Or alternatively, the world that I inhabit is this world of my creation. So of course we appreciate this is a completely different order of magnitude than the far, far more rarefied level of seeing reality in terms of one's own selfhood. But of course, again, what's critical in both instances despite the fact that now it's good versus evil. And evil is an alternative reality that exists. It is real, not like falsity that doesn't exist. What both choice in the anti-tree world and choice in the post-tree world have in common is you have the wherewithal, if you so choose, to embrace truth. And on this plane, what I feel is most critically germane in this discussion is a line that is presented in the Gemara and in the Midrash, in the Gemara, in Tractate Sotah, page 9b, in the Midrash, in Bamidbar Rabbah, in Parashat Tet. I can quote the line pithily, but then we need to understand the context that informs it. Nikarim, divrei emet. Words of truth are recognizable. Now, first, to give you the context. The context is, I must admit, so unseemly as to being almost revolting. The Gemara asks the question that after Samson had revealed the secret of his strength in his hair to Delilah. So we read in Judges chapter 16, Vateret Delilah ki higid la et kol libo. That Delilah saw that Samson, had told her all of his heart. She knew this was it. And the Gemara asks the obvious question. Mena yada. How did she know? After all, so many times previously, he already lied to her. So how did she know that this time it was the real thing? And it is to that question that the Gemara responds, Amar Rabbi Chanin, Amar Rav, Nikarim divrei emet. Words of truth are recognizable. She knew. And if anything, given the unseemly, even revolting context of this statement, it becomes all the more powerful. Even she knew. This temptress, this woman who signifies really the lowest of the low. And despite her utter depravity, we still enunciate this principle, even with respect to her. Words of truth are recognizable. If you want to connect with truth, you will connect with truth. And I can't help but note in this regard that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in Sefer Kuzari, in the fourth treatise of Sefer Kuzari, at the end of section 17, indeed quotes precisely this phrase, Nikarim divrei emet. And there it is in a far more expansive context. Truth be told, it is in a sublime context in Sefer Kuzari, where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi reflects upon the fact that the multitude, that is, people who aren't necessarily the highest echelons of scholastic achievement, nonetheless feel a resonance with the words of the prophets and not with the words of the philosophers, because nikarim divrei emet, because words of truth are recognizable. But we can generalize this further and recognize that words of truth are always recognizable. If you really want to connect with truth, you will. And so, apropos of the story of the smoker, we can be extraordinarily adept at duping ourselves, at accepting as truth what we know good and well is a lie. But that's exactly the point. We can dupe ourselves. we can choose to be duped. But someplace deep down inside, we know we're being duped. We know we're lying to ourselves. That, in fine, is free will. And it's important for me to stress this point, ironically, because on the one hand, as Rav Dessler notes, that extraordinarily limits the extent to which we, in fact, are able to bring free will to the fore in the choices that we make. Because to that extent, then, free will applies only in that domain of our affairs in which we can clearly, cogently sense that there are two alternatives. That there is truth and there is the lie that we can dupe ourselves into accepting as truth. And if you don't have both of those simultaneously available, then you don't have free will. What do I mean by that? It's very simple. Certainly, given our upbringing, given how we were trained over the course of our lives, given, moreover, the choices that we've made until now, there are domains in which there may be truths that are so sublime as to be categorically inaccessible to us. We don't hear the voice of truth at all. And to the extent that we don't hear the voice of truth at all, those ethereal levels of righteousness are really completely off limits to us. We don't have any free will with respect to being able to attain them. Simultaneously, there are also many domains in which we don't hear any voice of falsity beckoning, seducing us to do what we know is wrong. So none of us here has any cogent voice of falsity saying, oh, it's okay, just go ahead and kill somebody. We don't hear that at all. It is so deeply ingrained in us that committing such an atrocity is unconscionable that there's no voice of falsity to justify it. It's important for us to consider how it's possible for someone to get to a place where he can. But I'm just using this as an illustration of what Rav Dessler then goes on to describe as, in the Hebrew, nikudata bechira, that point at which we have free will, with the realization that there is a vast continuum of choices, and in practice, the free will is only coming to bear in that narrow swath where we are able to hear both voices and choose between them. He uses the illustration of two nations at war, where potentially, of course, the front line could be anywhere in the combined territory of both nations, potentially. But in practice, the fighting is taking place on a fairly narrow front line, because everything that's behind the front line on the one side is entirely in the domain of the one nation. Everything that's behind the front line on the other side is entirely in the domain of the other nation. And there's no fighting taking place there. So similarly with respect to free will, on the one hand, it's important for us to appreciate, does this limit the domain of free will, and how it does? It means that in most decisions that we make, we don't have free will. True. But what's far more important here is it enunciates the extent to which for every individual, there will be a domain in which that individual is choosing. Because for every individual, there will be a domain in which he hears both voices, both the voice of truth and the voice of falsity, and is indeed summoned to choose between them. Everywhere else, indeed, we inhabit a deterministic universe. We don't hear clearly, cogently, two alternatives, one true, one false, to be able to bring to bear that machinery with which each and every one of us is endowed, even Delilah, of Nikarim Divrei Emet, words of truth are recognizable. So there's an awful lot in life that 100% is deterministic. The critical thing for us to appreciate is that there's still going to be that domain in which we have free moral choice. And of course, introducing that M word, moral choice, is critical here. Because by the same token, we recognize that when we're speaking of choosing, here perhaps it is most directly germane for us to invoke the formulation of Ramban, that the transformation that took place in man is the acquisition of the ratzon, of will. That will is, on the one hand, the wherewithal to be able to apply my will to doing what's right. And simultaneously, on the other hand, an egotistical will. I want what's good for me, not what's right. And I'll do anything. I will reconstruct reality. I will fabricate a fake universe in order to justify what enables me to get what I want, even though it's an out and out lie, and I know it. Of course, this isn't anything new. This is our capacity to rationalize, with which human beings are extraordinarily adept. But again, we'll still reiterate that capacity is taking place only in a thin band for each and every one of us, choosing between the voice of truth and the voice of falsity. But then there's one additional dimension that, of course, we need to introduce here, which is that front line, of course, is not static. Because with every choice that we make, we're also transforming ourselves. That is, the Gemara gives us two principles that essentially are two sides of one coin. One, that once a person commits a sin and repeats it, the Gemara says, hutralo, it becomes permissible to him. Immediately, the Gemara asks, hutralo salgadaytech, do we really think it becomes permissible? And the Gemara amends the text, so to speak, naset lo keheter. It becomes as if permissible to him. That is, the moment that we habituate ourselves in doing something that we knew was wrong, we habituate, it becomes as if permissible, which means, placing it in the context of our discussion here, that by habituating oneself in doing what is wrong, we can indeed succeed in eviscerating the faculty that enables us to recognize that what we're doing is a lie, and we're no longer capable of seeing it as a lie. And by consequence, we lost our free will in that domain, because, like in the analogy of the two warring nations, that territory was conquered by the wrong side. Is all hope lost? No, because the opposite can happen as well, if we so choose. That is, to whatever extent we habituate ourselves in making the right decision. Well, the Gemara also makes this observation with respect to the words of Hannah, mother of Samuel, in her Song of Thanksgiving, second chapter of the book of Samuel, V'raglei chasidav yishmor, that God watches the feet of the pious, that once a person has been placed in a position in which he could have chosen badly and didn't, and refrained, and did the same once again. Having done so, God will protect him. In other words, precisely the polar opposite of what we noted with respect to committing a sin twice. Committing a sin twice, it becomes impermissible. Refraining from a sin twice, and now on some plane, God will protect him. Meaning in both instances, obviously, this is not a negation of the existence of free will. It's simply recognizing the front line shifts one way or the other, because free will is only taking place where I can cogently and clearly hear both alternatives. And to the extent that by my own choices, I lose the ability to hear one alternative or another, I haven't just changed my decisions, I've changed myself. It still is going to be essentially choosing between truth and falsity. Note, at the end of the day, that hasn't really changed. Except the context, the wherewithal to apply that machinery for choosing, of course, has changed, because I can create alternative realities all the time. And as I create these alternative realities, my choices are going to be choices that are defined in the context of these alternative realities. Truth versus falsity. What I know is true versus what I know is a lie, but can still dupe myself into accepting as truth because I have it inside me. I'm creating the alternative reality that justifies what I want to. And of course, again, to that extent, there are vast swaths of our lives that are completely deterministic. There are those who will posit that everything is deterministic as a result, and here we emphatically dissent. For every individual, there will be a domain in which we have the wherewithal to choose. And of course, goes without saying that it's only where you have the wherewithal to choose that you're really getting credit for choosing well. Everywhere on both other sides, well, on a positive plane, if I don't feel any summons to lie to myself, if I only hear the voice of truth, then my continuing on that upright course is something for which, on a practical plane, I'm not getting rewarded, except that it's all to be credited to either my earlier decisions or the positive influences upon me in my formative years that made it clear to me that there's no cogent voice of falsity that can beckon. And conversely, the same is true in the opposite direction. In those domains in which, again, as the Gemara expresses it, it becomes as if permissible for a person to sin because he no longer hears the voice of truth. Well, right now, as he continues to commit the same sin over and over again, he's no longer doing it as a reflection of free will. He's doing it under compulsion because he doesn't see any other alternative. Okay, but all of that is the responsibility of the bankrupt choices that he had made previously. Or alternatively, on some plane, the bankrupt choices that his mentors, that those who influenced him in his formative years had made, that placed his choices on such a bankrupt level. So anyway, we look in the world today, and this, of course, is something of which we are so painfully, unfathomably cognizant. People committing evil incarnate. And we can't even conceive of how anyone could possibly stoop to a level of such depravity. So how do you get such a level of depravity? Answer: this may sound excessively prosaic. Perhaps the banality of evil, of which Arendt spoke. How do you get to such a level of depravity? One small step at a time. choosing evil and then choosing more, and bankrupting that machinery for choosing between light and darkness, truth and falsity, one step at a time. One can pave the way for the pathway to hell. And while it's terrifying to consider how a person can choose to become a monster in that vein, of course, simultaneously, there's the flip side of the coin, which is actually extraordinarily uplifting. How do you become a tzaddik? Also, one small step at a time, by choosing well and choosing well again. One small step after another. One can reach the level at which that observation of Chana, v'raglei chasidav yishmor, which essentially identifies nothing more sublime or ethereal than a process of habituation. A process of habituation which can go badly or go well, and you can make yourself into a tzaddik. And in both instances, there still is going to remain that swath in which one is choosing freely, and the vast tracts on both sides in which one is not. But free will still is real and is vindicated. And on that note, Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll continue next time.